Bolam Lake lies hidden beneath a ceiling of ancient trees in Northumberland, England, a place so quiet that even the wind seems hesitant to disturb it. And for centuries, locals have described the water as unnaturally calm, not peaceful, but watchful, as if something beneath its dark surface was listening. On overcast days, the lake turns black, reflecting nothing, swallowing light entirely. And those who walk its narrow paths often report the strange sensation of being observed, a tightening in the chest that arrives without reason. Because Bolam is not a natural lake but an artificial one constructed in the 19th century, fed by marshland and slow-moving streams that carry more than just water into its depths. And long before the first official reports of a creature emerged, villagers spoke in hushed voices of ripples that moved against the wind, of sudden splashes when no animals were present, and of a shape that would briefly break the surface before vanishing again, leaving behind only widening circles that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. And fishermen were the first to notice that nets came back torn, hooks bent, and lines snapped clean through as if bitten by something powerful, something with intent. And by the early 1970s, these whispers would harden into fear, because Bolam Lake was about to earn a name that would cling to it like mist at dawn, the home of a beast that did not want to be seen, but wanted very much to be felt. The first official sighting of the creature at Bolam Lake was reported in the summer of 1974, when a local man out walking his dog claimed he saw something rise from the water that did not behave like any animal he had ever known, describing a long, dark form surfacing silently, its movements smooth and deliberate, not thrashing like a fish or struggling like a mammal, but gliding as though the lake itself was allowing it to pass. He would later say that for several seconds, the surface tension of the water seemed to cling to the thing's body, revealing a thick, rounded back and what appeared to be a small, horned or pointed head before it slipped back beneath the surface without a splash. And while such claims were easy to dismiss, what followed made them impossible to ignore. Because within weeks, multiple witnesses began coming forward, each unaware of the others, each describing remarkably similar details, dark coloration, unusual size, and an unsettling stillness. One woman reported watching the lake from her car when the water began to part as if something massive was turning just below, while another claimed she heard a deep, hollow sound. Not a roar, but a pressure-filled exhale, like air being forced through waterlogged lungs. And park authorities, hoping to calm growing unease, suggested the sightings were misidentified logs, large fish, or even seals that had somehow wandered inland. Yet no explanation accounted for the consistency of the reports, nor the way witnesses all spoke of the same thing afterward, the feeling that whatever lived in Bolam Lake was aware of them, watching from below, waiting for them to leave. By the end of that summer, Bolam Lake was no longer a place of quiet walks and idle fishing, because the activity in and around the water began to escalate in ways that could no longer be explained away as coincidence. With reports of dogs refusing to approach the shoreline, horses rearing when led too close, and birds taking sudden flight from the trees as if startled by something rising unseen below. And then there were the physical signs, the ones that left no room for imagination alone, because along the muddy banks deep grooves began to appear overnight, wide drag marks leading from the water and stopping abruptly among the reeds, as though something heavy had hauled itself partially onto land before reconsidering. And anglers found carcasses of fish torn apart in ways that did not match otters or pike, their bodies crushed rather than bitten, while the lake itself behaved strangely, developing sudden cold patches even in warm weather, areas where the water felt thick and resistant, almost oily to the touch. And one park worker would later recall hearing a violent disturbance after closing hours, a powerful thrashing followed by an unnatural silence, only to return the next morning and find the shoreline torn up, vegetation flattened, and the smell of rot hanging in the air, metallic and sour. And from that moment on, the fear surrounding Bolam Lake changed in character. Because people were no longer asking whether something lived there, but whether it could leave the water. And whether the beast, whatever it truly was, had begun to test the boundary between the depths and the land above. As stories of the beast spread beyond the surrounding villages, Bolam Lake began to attract a different kind of visitor. Not casual walkers or families, but men driven by obsession, skepticism, or the dangerous need to prove themselves right. And among them were two amateur investigators who arrived in early autumn of 1974 carrying cameras, measuring equipment, and the quiet arrogance of those convinced they were chasing nothing more than folklore. And they set up along the eastern bank just before dusk, noting unusual temperature drops in the water and a persistent vibration beneath the surface that caused their equipment to tremble slightly. A detail they laughed off at first until the lake began to respond, because shortly after nightfall, the water near their position started to ripple in wide. Deliberate arcs, far too controlled to be wind-driven. And one of the men whispered that something large was circling below them, moving slowly, patiently. And as they shone their torchlight across the surface, the beam caught a brief, unmistakable shape, a curved mass rising just high enough to displace the water around it, followed by a sudden, violent surge that drenched the shoreline and knocked one of them backward into the mud. And while neither man was taken that night, both would later admit the same chilling realization. The movement was not random. It was investigative, as though the creature was learning their position, measuring their reactions, and deciding how close it was willing to come. And when they packed up and left before dawn, shaken and silent, they carried with them the uncomfortable truth that Bolam Lake was no passive habitat, but a controlled space. And whatever lived there did not simply exist within it dominated it. The first evidence that the creature of Bolam Lake was capable of moving beyond the water appeared quietly, almost apologetically, as a series of impressions discovered along a narrow forest trail less than 50 yards from the shoreline. Impressions that did not resemble footprints in any conventional sense, but looked more like deep pressure marks, wide and elongated, as if something heavy had pressed itself down into the soil rather than stepped upon it. And park rangers initially assumed the damage was caused by fallen branches or erosion, until they noticed the patterned niche mark spaced evenly apart, leading away from the lake, curving briefly through the trees, and then returning back toward the water, suggesting a deliberate excursion rather than random disturbance. And what troubled them most was the depth of the impressions. Some sunk nearly 8 inches into hardened ground, implying a weight far beyond that of any known animal in the region. And when plaster casts were taken, they revealed irregular edges, not clean or clawed, but rounded, almost organic, as though the surface of the thing that made them was soft, yet immensely dense. And soon after, nearby residents began reporting nighttime disturbances, low-frequency vibrations that rattled windows, a wet, dragging sound moving through undergrowth, and the overpowering smell of stagnant water lingering in the air long after the sounds had faded. And though no one would admit it openly, the unspoken fear grew heavier with each new report, because these were not the signs of a creature lost or wandering, but of one testing its surroundings, learning routes, memorizing terrain, and proving to itself that the boundary of Bolam Lake was not a barrier at all. The incident that silenced much of the speculation around Bolam Lake occurred on a gray afternoon when a solitary fisherman, a man familiar with the lake and its moods, failed to return home. And at first, his absence was not alarming, because he was known to spend long hours alone by the water. But when his car was found still parked near the southern bank at dusk, concern turned quickly into dread, and a search party was organized that same evening, their torches sweeping across reeds and trees until they reached the shoreline where his fishing gear lay abandoned, neatly arranged as if he had stepped away for only a moment. And closest to the water, they found signs of disturbance, mud churned violently, Reeds snapped low to the ground, and a single, wide drag mark leading straight into the lake, stopping abruptly at the water's edge, as though the ground itself had been pulled inward. And divers were brought in the following morning. But what they encountered below was not debris or human remains, but a sudden and overwhelming pressure in the water, an inexplicable resistance that forced them back toward the surface, accompanied by a deep internal vibration that could be felt through bone and teeth. And one diver would later say it felt as though the lake was closing around him, tightening. Rejecting intrusion, and after only minutes, the search was called off. Officially, due to safety concerns, though unofficially, many believed something far worse was at play, because no body was ever recovered. No explanation given that satisfied those who stood on that shore, staring into the black water. Realizing that Bolam Lake had not simply taken a man but had chosen not to give him back. As authorities quietly restricted access to Bolam Lake and dismissed further investigation, a few locals began looking backward instead of outward, searching parish records, estate journals, and half-forgotten folklore for any sign that the beast had existed before it was seen. And what they found suggested that the lake's story did not begin with its construction in the 19th century at all. Because long before the water pooled there, the land had been marked as dangerous. Described in medieval records as unstable ground, a place of sinkholes, bogs, and sudden disappearances where livestock would vanish overnight, leaving behind only disturbed earth and the lingering smell of rot. And one fragmented account spoke of a black swelling beneath the soil, something that moved when the ground was wet and quiet, while another described a forbidden hollow avoided by hunters because animals refused to enter it. And when the estate dammed the land to create the lake, flooding the marsh and sealing the hollow beneath tons of water, it may not have buried the problem at all, but contained it, trapping whatever had once moved freely beneath the soil into a deep, cold enclosure. And the more these records were examined, the more unsettling the implication became. Because the creature of Bolam Lake was not a new presence awakened by chance, but an old one restrained by water, sustained by it, and perhaps slowly growing stronger as the years passed, waiting patiently for the moment when containment would no longer be enough. Among the many stories that surfaced during the renewed interest in Bolam Lake's past, one account stood apart for its sheer intimacy. Given by an elderly groundskeeper who had worked the park for decades and knew the lake's rhythms better than anyone. And he described a night patrol in the late 1980s when the forest was unnaturally still. No insects, no birds, no wind in the leaves. Only the faint lap of water against the bank. And as he stood listening, he became aware of another sound emerging slowly from beneath the surface. Not a splash or a movement, but a deep, rhythmic exhalation, measured and deliberate, like something massive breathing in its sleep. And he said the sound seemed to travel through the water rather than over it, vibrating up through his boots and into his chest, locking him in place with a primal fear he could not explain. And when he shone his torch toward the lake, the beam barely penetrated the blackness before being swallowed whole, and in that moment the breathing stopped, replaced by a pressure so intense he felt it behind his eyes, as if something had become aware of him. And though nothing surfaced, nothing touched him, he fled the shoreline and never patrolled the lake at night again. And years later, when asked why he never reported the incident, his answer was simple and chilling. Some things do not make noise to be heard. They make noise so you know they are still there. As the years passed, descriptions of the creature at Bolam Lake began to shift in ways that deeply unsettled those trying to categorize it, because witnesses no longer spoke only of something aquatic, but of a form that appeared wrong in its proportions, emerging higher from the water than before, lingering longer at the surface, and revealing glimpses of structure that suggested intent rather than instinct, with some claiming to see what looked like a raised neck or upper body, thick and muscular, while others reported symmetrical movements beneath the surface, as if limbs were being drawn inward and outward in a slow, deliberate rhythm. And one particularly disturbing account came from a couple walking the perimeter trail at dusk who stopped when the lake grew suddenly still, the water flattening unnaturally as a dark mass rose just below the surface, close enough that they could see the outline of something broad and hunched, before the surface broke briefly and they caught sight of what they described as a hollow depression where a face should have been. Not eyes or a mouth, but a suggestion of them, like features forming beneath skin too thick to move properly. And the couple fled, but what lingered with them was not the image itself, but the sense that the creature was no longer hiding its form completely, as though the long years beneath the water had reached a turning point. And Bolam Lake was no longer merely containing a beast, it was reshaping one. By the mid-1990s, Bolam Lake had developed a reputation so fearsome that locals avoided it after dark. And even during daylight, the shoreline had an unspoken perimeter, a stretch of reeds and mud that people instinctively refused to cross. Because those who did reported immediate unease, a pulling sensation toward the water, low vibrations that seemed to emanate from the mud itself, and, on rare occasions, fleeting glimpses of movement beneath the surface, fast and purposeful, as though whatever dwelled below was testing its ability to emerge. And one afternoon, a group of teenagers ignored the warnings, sneaking down to the eastern edge with cameras and recording equipment, and while laughing nervously at first, the air thickened as they approached, the water near them suddenly darker, unnaturally still, and then, without warning, the surface erupted in a violent surge, slamming waves over their legs and knocking them to the ground, the sound like a giant exhale, wet and metallic, and in that moment they saw it. A dark form twisting in ways that defied logic, massive yet fluid, retreating just as quickly as it had risen, leaving the teens soaked and terrified. And from that day forward, the shoreline itself seemed to act as a warning, the water no longer passive, but reactive, teaching all who approached that Bolam Lake was no longer simply a hiding place for a creature. It had become an extension of the creature itself. And every inch of mud, reed, and shallow water was its domain, alive with intent, ready to enforce boundaries that no human could breach without consequence. In the autumn of 1997, a local angler named Thomas Bennett, a man in his 40s who had fished Bolam Lake for years and prided himself on knowing every bend of the shoreline, disappeared without a trace, and his absence immediately struck fear into the community. Because, unlike previous incidents, this one happened in broad daylight, under the watchful eyes of passers-by, and the details reported afterward painted a picture both mundane and terrifying. For witnesses said he had been standing knee-deep in water near the northern bank, adjusting his line when the lake's surface shifted unnaturally, forming a dark, rising swell around him. And though he struggled briefly to regain balance, he was pulled forward by a force so strong it seemed to originate from beneath him, as if the water itself had become solid in some areas and liquid in others. And friends on the shore described hearing a wet, sucking sound, followed by a sudden silence, the line disappearing from his hands as if swallowed, the ripples flattening abruptly, and when authorities arrived minutes later, there was no trace of Bennett, no footprints leading away from the water. No abandoned gear, nothing, only the smooth, empty surface of the lake, reflecting the overcast sky as though nothing had happened. And locals later whispered that the lake had chosen him, that it remembered every intruder and would act decisively. And though investigators conducted thorough searches, divers explored every inch and helicopters scanned the water for hours, Thomas Bennett was never found, and the story spread like wildfire, cementing Bolam Lake's reputation as a place where curiosity met consequence, and the water could claim what it wished, giving nothing back. It was during a quiet November evening that hikers reported the first confirmed sighting of the creature moving onto land. a terrifying evolution of the Bolam Lake legend. And the encounter occurred near a shallow inlet where the reeds thinned and mud met forest. And witnesses described a massive, undulating form emerging from the water with a grace that was impossible for something of its size. Limbs, or what could only be called limbs, pressing against the mud as it hauled itself forward. Skin dark and slick, glistening with water. Yet clearly defined in the low light, head and shoulders lifting just enough to suggest awareness. And the air grew heavy, vibrating with the creature's presence. The ground beneath trembling faintly as it advanced, forcing the hikers to freeze in horror, unable to breathe or even scream. While nearby birds and wildlife fled in a panicked flurry, the only sound remaining a low, guttural exhalation that reverberated through the trees, a warning or perhaps a calculation. And then, as quickly as it appeared, the figure receded, slipping back into the lake with astonishing speed, leaving only drag marks and churned mud as proof that the beast had tested the boundary between its watery domain and dry land. A stark reminder that Bolam Lake was no longer merely a hiding place, but the lair of a creature whose dominion extended far beyond what anyone had feared. And from that day forward, the legend took on a new terror, because the beast was no longer confined, and neither were its victims safe. In recent years, Bolam Lake has become a place of eerie quiet, where the surrounding woods are thick with mist that rolls in from the water and swallows entire paths. And locals speak of strange lights reflecting off the surface at night, unexplainable noises, and shadowed shapes slipping beneath the ripples just out of sight. While hikers and joggers sometimes report the faintest hints of movement in the reeds, almost imperceptible until it is too late. And digital evidence has begun to appear on line-grainy photographs capturing elongated shapes beneath the water. Short video clips showing ripples moving against the wind, and even audio recordings of low, wet exhalations that seem to echo across the lake in impossible directions. And those who analyze the data note patterns too consistent to be random, as if the creature has learned to be observed yet remains untouchable. And older residents claim that the mist itself carries warnings, voices just below the threshold of hearing, whispering names or repeating warnings. And when the fog is thick, some swear they can feel pressure on their bodies, not enough to cause harm, but enough to remind them that Bolam Lake is alive with awareness, and that the beast, though rarely seen in full, continues to claim dominion over its domain, teaching a lesson older than any of them could comprehend. Some places remember the weight of what has been submerged, and some creatures never forget those who trespass. Over the past decade, amateur explorers and paranormal enthusiasts have returned to Bolam Lake armed with night vision cameras, drones, and thermal imaging, hoping to capture evidence of the creature. And while many leave disappointed, a few recordings have surfaced that defy rational explanation, showing sudden disturbances in the water where no wind blows, shapes darting just beneath the surface, and shadows that move independently of waves or currents. And in one particularly chilling video, a drone hovering over the lake captured a massive form breaking the surface, the dark body rising slowly before twisting in ways that no animal could manage. And for a brief moment, the camera picked up what appeared to be a hollow depression where a face should have been, followed by a violent submersion that sent ripples radiating outward. And those present on the shore reported feeling an invisible force, a pressure in the air that seemed to push them backward. And when footage was reviewed frame by frame, the ripples aligned perfectly with the movement of the submerged shape, suggesting intelligence, awareness, and an almost playful manipulation of perception. And yet, even as technology confirms the creature's presence, it remains elusive, untouchable, and aware, reminding anyone who dares to investigate that Bolam Lake has not become a site of legend simply because of stories. It has become one because the creature itself chooses when and how to be seen. And what is recorded is never the whole truth. The final and most unsettling aspect of Bolam Lake is not what rises from its waters, nor what drags itself across its shores, but the way it seems to linger in the minds of those who have encountered it, because survivors, witnesses, and even casual visitors report experiences that persist long after they leave. From nightmares in which the water rises to swallow them, to fleeting sensations of wet, cold pressure at the soles of their feet while walking along other lakes, to the inexplicable feeling that something is watching whenever they see a body of water at night. And some have taken to documenting every sighting, every ripple, every faint exhalation caught on microphone, only to realize that the lake has begun to shape their perception, instilling caution, fear, and respect in equal measure. And researchers note that patterns of sightings increase after heavy rain or unusual tides, suggesting the creature responds not only to human presence, but to environmental changes, as though it is intimately connected to the water itself. And yet, despite all the evidence, no one has ever come close to capturing it fully, and the lake remains both a physical and psychological boundary, a place where curiosity can become obsession and fear becomes memory. Teaching a lesson older than any local folklore, Bolam Lake remembers every trespass, and the beast within it does not forgive, does not forget, and waits patiently for those who dare to underestimate the darkness that lies just beneath its calm surface.